Okay, I want to welcome you to Interpreting Contemporary Culture. And by now, we have gone through a number of lectures, so you're familiar with the format. I know that in your syllabus it says something to the effect that the title of this particular lecture was going to be The Colliding Bubbles of Cultural Encounters. But I've decided to rename this session Improving Our CQ, or borrowing that phrase from Livermore, cultural quotient, improving our cultural quotient, the art and science of cultural interpretation. So that's exactly what I want to take you through in the next several minutes with these slides that we have available to us. One of the things that I want to build on from last time we were together, we really began to look at looking below the surface. And one of the primary ways we begin to look below the surface is actually by looking at the surface itself. What do cultural goods and artifacts, products, texts, what do they begin to tell us about the assumptions, beliefs, values of the cultures that we encounter on a daily basis? What do they tell us about what's underneath the surface? And so in this particular session, what we are going to begin to do is try and ask the sorts of questions that help us get to where it is that we want to go. But before we get to all of that, I want to introduce to you some aspects of how we go about looking at culture, and then we're going to get to the questions that we should be asking of culture. So the collision of yesterday's cultural goods, anything that we see, there's all sorts of examples of this. We have collisions of cultural goods from yesterday and today, and eventually for those things that will come tomorrow. The collision of yesterday's cultural goods are going to interact with us today in our ability to create new culture. So it's not just simply a matter of living in a vacuum and coming up with cultural goods. No, no, no. There's all sorts of things that are building that are available to us today because of the goods of yesterday. I was thinking of examples in our own city the other day. I took my kids to Kennefic Park. There are two massive locomotives that overlook the river valley here in Omaha as you drive across the bridge. One is from the 20th century, one early 20th century, one is from the late 20th century. And really they are cultural goods that have built on one another. We started with much smaller steam locomotives, and if you go back even further than that, you have these almost pedal cars that you would push, and then they got bigger and better and faster, and so we see that we have cultural goods that build on one another. There's a collision of cultural goods yesterday that makes some things possible for today. Maybe we could look at the space program. If you're not a locomotives person, maybe you can think about the space program and the shuttles and the astronauts that are going up. Some people like to think that the space program probably ought to be done away with and we shouldn't spend any more money. But the reality of it is there's so much research that goes into the space program that you and I are the benefactors in cultural goods that we use every single day. Most of the vacuum hoses that we have available to us in our homes today were things that were designed originally that went on spacesuits and things of that nature. So it's not just a matter of looking at cultural goods that were in a vacuum, but actually finding the collision where these things are taking place. What we need to recognize is that cultural goods are not static. There's a collision of what was and what is, and then even maybe what is to come in regards to cultural good. And so it's a cumulative effect of culture. Andy Crouch writes this: so culture is cumulative. our cultural products become part of the world that a future generation must make something of. So again, it's a cumulative effect that makes all of this possible. Maybe we could begin to think of it this way. In one of Crouch's books, in fact, the book that you've been reading out of, Culture Makers, he writes about waterways or highways, waterways and highways, as a piece of a large cultural good that is normal to you and I, but wasn't always. So maybe in the early portions of the history of our country, we had waterways. We had the technology to make things possible like canals. But now we have roadways to the west, which initially were not roads at all. The initial roadway to the west was the railroad. And so you had canals giving way to railroads, and then railroads giving way to the highway system. 1956, President Eisenhower signs the Federal Aid Highway Act, and the world really that you and I travel in and are a part of changes almost overnight, as now we're able to get into our automobile and go from one end of the country to the other without going on a railroad car. So this is culture as a cumulative effect. You see, what is originally shaped is shaped and reshaped again and again over time, and in the present it is considered contemporary. We have art. And if you know art, and one of the things that hopefully you'll see on this trip to Chicago that we'll take in November, is that when we go into the Art Institute, I hope that you begin to see the collision of ideas, the collision of even certain styles of art that one generation of artists borrows some aspects to their art for the next generation, that this is constantly being reshaped and shaped again, and today we call that contemporary. Now, one of the things that you need to recognize is that there are various pools. There are various pools of culture, and they are constantly interacting with one another. They're not mutually exclusive to one another. Again, this is not a static issue. Culture is not static. Goods and artifacts, cultural goods and products, they're not static. They're constantly interacting with one another, and they're interacting to make more things possible or to make some things impossible. They're producing more and new cultural goods. They're interacting to create more and better cultural bubbles, if you will. And at times, really throughout our culture, they're going to be impacting families, impacting heritage, impacting bits of every single day of our lives. Think about it for a moment from the perspective of James Cameron. He's the director of things like the Titanic and the director of Avatar. Now, he had an idea long before Avatar about creating this particular movie. But he knew that the technology needed to catch up to the idea. So he knew that with this particular thing that he wanted to do, that another pool of culture and cultural goods would have to catch up with where he was in his idea. So culture in its wholeness and in its various complex aspects, you just need to know it's not static. It's something that is flexing and moving all the time. It's colliding, it's creating new cultural goods, it's making more things possible for us and other things less possible for us. Crouch writes, after many thousands of years of accumulating human culture, the world which we must make something of, the environment in which we carry on the never-ending human cultural project, is largely the world others before us have made. Culture, even more than nature, defines for us the horizons of possibility and impossibility. We live in the world that culture has made. We live in the world that culture has made. If you go back all the way to the very beginnings of mankind, and we go back to ancient ruins and look at different pieces of art and maybe how they communicated and artifacts that they've left behind, we recognize that culture shapes culture. And new cultural goods make some things possible and other things impossible. But we didn't stop and start over again. We just simply accumulated those bits of culture, in fact, to where we are now, making a lot of things possible for us. So take a cultural context of which you're currently a part, anyone. Now think of 3 questions an outsider should ask that would help them understand your particular cultural context. Maybe you choose an ethnic culture that you're a part of. Maybe you choose a generational culture. Maybe you choose an aspect of pop culture. Whatever it is, pretend that you're an outsider. What are 3 questions that you would ask yourself if you were the outsider? The idea here is that you know your cultural context better. Remember, as we ended last time, one of the things that we discovered was that if we want to raise our cultural quotient, we need to develop an understanding, at least a better understanding, certainly of our own cultural context. So what are 3 questions that you would ask yourself? Think about this as we move throughout this presentation, throughout this session. And I would love for you to jot down 3 questions that you'd ask yourself, maybe to try and generate understanding of who you are in light of your culture. So let me give you some examples of these cultural bubbles. There are all sorts of cultural bubbles. I give you 6 as examples here. High culture, low culture, ethnic culture, generational culture, organizational culture, and pop culture. Now, there are all sorts of really bubbles that we could talk about. Interpreting any one piece of culture bears some difficulty, but it's necessary for anyone and everyone who desires to become culturally competent to realize that culture is neither stagnant or idle. So we have these bubbles. Each bubble is capable of producing order from chaos in its own right. But it may be better to realize that the interactions within the bubbles themselves and with other cultural bubbles around them are responsible for shaping new and powerful culture every single day. So let me walk you through some of these examples of bubbles. We have high culture. High culture is, or have all sorts of cultural goods associated with this particular set of, or this particular pool or bubble of culture. There's culture and cultural goods that are shared by an upper crust of society. It is the shared environment, the practices and resources of everyday life for this limited upper crust audience of any society. And many of the things are going to be communicated in written form because the assumption is that they have a background, a capacity, and a sophistication to analyze and perceive certain cultural goods. Maybe the classics, maybe the symphony. So take a piece of high culture. Maybe it's money and power. Maybe it's large homes or classic literature. It's going to make certain cultural goods accessible to certain people. Maybe it's Harvard or Yale. Maybe it's country clubs and art galleries. On the other side, you have maybe low culture. Culture and cultural goods that are shared by a people in a similar environment with similar practices and resources for living everyday life, just like the high culture, but this time on the opposite end. And they're limited to a more or less working class. Maybe you can't make the same assumptions you would with high culture, but you can certainly make some assumptions about who they are and what their values might be. Many things in this bubble would be communicated orally. The assumption would be that these folks may not have the time and ability to connect with other people in the same way that the high culture folks would. But they would have the time and ability to connect with other people in an environment that they can speak orally and one-on-one and in groups, and they can do so with great clarity. Maybe some examples of low culture might be tuxedo t-shirts, or the movie Ricky Bobby, or Demolition Derby. These kinds of things might be low culture kinds of things. But nonetheless, it's a powerful subset of a bubble that's very present in our own American context. The point is that anyone who desires to interpret culture cannot look at one bubble at a time, but rather has to look at several bubbles at the same time, and asking key questions of those bubbles in regard to how they interact with all the other bubbles around them. I've tried to give you a visual of what this might look like. I've entitled it Cultural Collisions. You have to begin to understand that it's not just about one cultural bubble. It's about 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 cultural bubbles interacting with each other all at the same time. Maybe think about culture number 1 on the screen being organizational culture, and culture number 2 representing generational culture, while culture number 3 is ethnic culture. Maybe begin to think about how those particular bubbles interact with one another. We can't control how they interact, but we know that they are going to interact. We need to know how the different cultures are going to interact with one another in different environments. How does, let's say, the organizational environment and the culture at NC impact the socio-ethnic culture at NC? Or how does the generational bubble interact with the organizational bubble? Cultural bubbles regularly impact one another. So the key is trying to ask the right questions to figure out how in the world do we recognize these overlaps in our culture, these cultural collisions, and ask the right questions to kind of determine, well, how are they going to respond to one another in key ministry environments? So how are generational, to give another example, how are generational cultural bubbles going to interact with organizational culture bubbles, with ethnic culture bubbles in a youth ministry? Let's say you have an organization where it's very top down. The pastor's the ruler. But you have generationally, you have a millennium or a Gen X group that's suspicious of authority. So there's automatic tension between the two bubbles. And add to that, perhaps, a regular suspicion by a particular ethnic group that happens to be a large part of your church. You're going to need to know how these cultural bubbles are going to interact with one another in order to lead well through those cultural tensions. So my encouragement to you is to look and try and figure out, first of all, what are the bubbles that are in my current ministry situations, and then how do those cultural bubbles interact with one another? The questions that you might begin to ask is, well, what's the advantage when this culture, let's say the organizational culture, consistently interacts with the generational culture? You might say, well, what are the disadvantages? Then you might say, well, what does it make possible? Or what does it make impossible in my current ministry situation? What opportunities exist for new culture in our ministry environment? And then, what values, beliefs, assumptions, and perceptions are colliding here that I need to be aware of? So all of these things are going to be very important for you as you move forward. Look at the diagram again as I've drawn it up. Developing good CQ is learning to articulate the areas of cultural collision. In other words, where do the bubbles collide? You want to look at the overlap and say, all right, what's going on here? And interpreting any number of cultural bubble collision is a matter of really finding different ways of raising cultural quotient. Interpreting any number of cultural bubble collisions is a matter of several different items. Let me give you some of those items as we break this down. Interpreting cultural bubbles is a matter of, first of all, seeking the awareness of what's below the surface. Livermore says this a number of times, but let me just say it again. You have to seek an awareness of what lies below the surface, below the level of just simply cultural goods. Certainly you want to look at the cultural goods of what they say about the way the world is, but you want to begin to try and ask the appropriate question. Why do I think and act the way I do? Why might the other think and act the way they do? Wisdom will ask what is needed to be understood before demanding understanding. Always ask the question, how can I understand before being understood? I think it's Stephen Covey in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that simply says, before you charge in, try and be understanding before demanding to be understood. This is what it means to seek awareness of what's below the surface. Secondly, if you want to develop cultural skills in interpreting any number of cultural bubble collisions, then secondly, what you're going to need to do is intentionally reflect by asking the right questions. What you're saying is, what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? You might ask things like, why did this bother me? Why did this stun me? Why did this make me happy? Several years ago, I was in Greece, and I had brought a little George monkey to just act as like a character everywhere we went in the ancient world. I would set him up next to a statue and then punch the picture. I was thinking, of course, that this was a very fun way of having George travel around the world. But I remember in Athens, we were looking at the Olympic Stadium that had happened not too long before that. And we had gone to where the opening ceremonies were, and I remember setting up George with the stadium in the background, and a particular Grecian man was looking at me with the most disgust that could have possibly been mustered by him at that time. I was totally oblivious to anything that I may have done. But thinking back on it later, I thought, well, there is a cultural collision happening there, and I may begin to try and intentionally reflect by asking questions. Maybe asking the question, well, why did this bother him? Why did this stun him? Why did this make him happy or sad? Again, trying to put myself in the shoes of another. Another way you might get at this is, what assumptions have I made about the organizational culture? What assumptions have I made about the generational culture or the ethnic culture? Are there assumptions I make about that culture that are true, that are right? And then maybe asking the question, well, how could I test the assumptions I have made? Let's face it, all of us make assumptions about other cultures. And so when they collide and we say, that's really strange, but they think it's normal, we have to step back and challenge our own assumptions and say, well, is this right? And how do I test whether I'm right or not? Another developing cultural skill is just simply purposeful empathy. Being purposeful in attempting to walk in another's shoes. Several years ago, I was in a seminary classroom, and I remember my professor challenging us to think of what it would be like if we were entirely different. Would we find our self-worth in exactly the same way? And I challenge you with the same. Would you value yourself the same if, let's say, you woke up tomorrow with black skin instead of white skin, or if you had white skin instead of black skin, or if you were a Latino or a Filipino or a Nepalese person or Chinese or Japanese, or you were of Middle Eastern descent. If you woke up tomorrow, would you think of yourself more or less? You see, it goes right to the heart of the kind of cultural engagement that we're trying to understand. If we would value ourselves more, then perhaps we don't value our own culture enough. If we would value ourselves less, then perhaps we need to understand something more about the culture in which we obviously disdain at some level. It gets right to the quick. It cuts right to the quick of who we are and what we value. It raises to the surface all sorts of the kinds of assumptions that we're going to make about another culture. So if you were to wake up and you were someone else, would you value yourself the same? How would you see things? How would you respond to things? I'm going to put up a series of photos, and here's what I want you to do. Each slide says the very same thing. What I'd like you to do is look at the cultural collision in the photo. I want you just to meditate on the photo for several moments, maybe even several minutes. Pause the video, look at it, and begin to ask yourself key questions. Answer the key questions that I've just talked to you through. What are the advantages, disadvantages? What does it make possible or impossible? How would you seek awareness or intentionally reflect? How would you seek purposeful empathy in these cultural collisions? Here's the first one. The first cultural collision is right here. Here's this very white young girl next to this fairly old Aborigine man, dressed up in his native Aborigine gear. What cultures are colliding? What questions would you ask? What could we conclude about this cultural collision? How can you develop your own skill here in intentionally trying to understand the cultures that are colliding? Again, I encourage you to take some time with each individual photo. Here's the next one. Recently, we had an interesting encounter in the Middle East. As we were on our way to Nepal, we had to stop over in the Middle East, and we went to a McDonald's. Of course, the signs were different, and the sandwiches were much different than we are used to in the U.S. But this is another one. I'm not going to point out the different kinds of things in this particular cultural collision, but what do you see? What do you notice? What are the cultural collisions that are taking place? What questions ought to be asked? What do you assume? What shouldn't you assume? What kinds of things would be different if you were part of that culture? Again, take some time and look through. The last one is kind of a fun one. It's interesting, isn't it? You have the same thing being said in two very different contexts. Again, this highlights the purposeful empathy. They both say the same thing, and yet they approach each other in a very different way. If we go all the way back to one of our first sessions together, we recognize that we do this because we have a desire to love the other. We have a desire to love the other and present the gospel. If we want to do that, then one of the things that we need to be able to do is not just look past each other, but we need to understand each other before being understood. There are all sorts of questions that we can ask, but I want to encourage you to begin to ask and notice and observe and assume all the right things. Maybe as an exercise, you can begin to think of cultural collisions that have taken place in the real world. Let's take in Livermore's book a black man who grows up in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. And then there is a young middle-class man, and they are sharing neighborhoods. And he notices, just briefly, because he's somewhat culturally aware, that he flinches at his rather large dog. Why does he flinch at his dog? Does he just walk on and say, "Ah, I can't believe that. He's a nice dog. You really should get to know him"? Or does he take the time and try and understand? Perhaps it's because the black man growing up in the Civil Rights Movement recognized that the dogs belonged to the police, and he saw as dogs were released on groups of people with the wrong colored skin in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. And so ever since then, he has always been a little shy when it comes to dogs. But it opens up an opportunity for both sides of different ethnic cultures to really begin to understand one another. Maybe it's something like what we see in the movie Pretty Woman. There's a successful businessman and a prostitute in a red light district. Maybe they begin to sit down and actually try and understand the worlds in which both of them come from. Maybe it's something like Kurt Warner, who was a Kmart employee, gone from Kmart stock boy to the NFL and celebrity status. Maybe we can begin to understand if we seek understanding first before wanting to be understood. Come up with a real-life cultural collision of your own and begin to ask the questions that we're wrestling with here. When these cultural bubbles overlap, when they collide, what do we notice? What do we see? What do we experience? What do we feel? What stuns us? What doesn't stun us? All of these different things. So with this in mind, let me give you approaches to how we go about looking at culture. Now, one of the things that you need to know is that we all, consciously or subconsciously, take an approach to culture. We're none of us neutral on an approach. We all take an approach. Here are several approaches that are very popular. Richard Niebuhr, of course, is one of the folks who really put Christ and culture on the map. Certainly help generate conversation in the Christian world about Christianity and culture. So we'll talk some later about some more of these things and whether or not we should or should not be avoiding certain aspects of culture. But understand we all take an approach. Here's what I would encourage you to do. With the approaches that I'm going to lay out for you in the rest of this session, what I would encourage you to do is just kind of peg yourself. Currently, right now, which approach do I take? Niebuhr writes about several different approaches. Am I Christ against culture? Maybe this is embodied in either or tendencies between Christ and culture. There's absolute truth and there is contemporary culture. And they are night and day difference between one another. There's certainly no interaction. The Bible says it, I believe it, and that settles it. Generally speaking, these people are going to be very, very conservative. Probably not going to do a whole lot of movies or cultural interaction. And if there is a sharp tone to anything that disagrees with Christ and culture, or with Christ, and it's either this or it's this. There's no in between. Another approach, according to Niebuhr, is Christ against culture, number one. Number two, Christ and culture, or Christ of culture. Christ's life and teaching are seen as achievements of human culture. Oftentimes, Christ's life and teaching are embodied in cultural institutions, maybe like governments. All truth equals God's truth here. There's the Christ above culture. He emphasizes the idea that culture can be a mediator of God's truth and of God's grace. Maybe that we can actually use culture, but which ultimately lies with God rather than human achievement. Our greatest aspirations, perhaps that of love, come from Christ. Christ and culture in paradox. Christ and culture are seen as separate and autonomous aspects of life. We have Christ on one side, culture on the other. Human culture, in spite of its flaws, just has to be tolerated, just as Christians must be obedient to God's people. To God, people must be obedient to institutions within culture. And so we kind of live as separate entities. And Christ, the transformer of culture, sees human nature as flawed, but encourages engagement with culture rather than withdrawal. Christ's truth becomes the resource whereby contemporary culture is critiqued and challenged. Of course, we can look at that and maybe say what we long for is the Christ of transforming culture. But Niebuhr's approaches to culture aren't the only ones. Let me give you some by a guy by the name of George Lynch. These approaches assume that one should indeed enter into a dialogue with culture as a Christian in some way. I appreciate Lynch on this because I think that, as we've talked about already, there is no gospel-less culture. Every culture, every Christian ought to be engaging the culture at some level. Here are some approaches that he takes. The applicationist. The applicationist is culture is subject to critique from established beliefs and value systems derived from theological convictions. This is, I know what I believe. I have the facts, and anything that doesn't agree with it, I can throw rocks at. One establishes core truths from the Bible and applies them critically to culture. I have them, and that's culture. That's the world. I need to stay away, and I'm going to critique anything that doesn't agree. It evaluates culture to the extent it fits with the presupposed ideas about the religion. Culture is evaluated positively or negatively to the extent it fits with the already established truths. Don't confuse me with the facts. I know what I believe. That would be somewhat of the applicationist. So we have to begin to ask ourselves, well, what's the advantage of disadvantage of this sort of thinking? What might be an example of this sort of dialogical approach? Lynch says, secondly, that there's another sort of approach, the correlational. This is where, on the opposite end of the applicationist, that culture sets the tone for the conversation. Culture gets to ask and raise the questions about life. They get to establish the conversation. So in the applicationist view, the Bible, our beliefs, that is the beginning of the conversation. In the correlational view, the culture gets to establish the beginning and the end and the questions in between about the conversation that we're going to have. And then answers can come through theological truths. The key is seeing that culture sets the tone for the dialogue. One of the ideas is that culture beyond the church may have an important and constructive role in shaping our understanding of existence. So the question for the church is, can culture inform the church? Can culture inform our own doctrine? Can culture inform our theology in positive ways? Can we learn something from the culture that perhaps we don't know about on our own just simply by reading the Bible? One presents another idea of this whole correlational approach. One presents answers from Christianity and truth that is intelligible and relevant to that particular cultural context. But again, the culture sets the tone for the dialogue. They are the ones out in culture, if you will. Culture gets to ask the question. The Bible doesn't necessarily get to ask the question. That's the key. So we have to ask, well, is this true? Is it untrue? Is the question or answer that they're proposing true or untrue? And we have to try and think, well, what are some examples of this sort of dialogue? Perhaps one of the things that I will ask you to do at the end of this session is to look at a couple Lady Gaga songs. This would be a correlational approach. I'm asking you to look at a song and raise the issues from the song itself about the issues about life and love and how we go about living. Then maybe you can apply theological truth to those sorts of songs. But these aren't the only approaches that Lynch talks about. There's the revised correlational. Rather than just allowing culture to rule the dialogue, like the correlational view, or rather than just letting the Bible or the religion or Christianity to rule all the cultural dialogue, it becomes a complex conversation in this revised correlational view. It becomes this complex conversation from both culture and the church, and with both sides ask questions and provide answers. So the culture can ask questions of the church, and the church can ask questions of culture, and both can provide answers, and both can be sharpened. It becomes a two-way street. Christianity and truth and culture can both be challenged and sharpened really by one another. Questions important in religious tradition can have a place in contemporary culture. So we begin to ask questions of culture at large, and culture at large begins to ask questions of us. It can also be that answers given to contemporary issues and circumstances within culture can sharpen issues of meaning and value in religious tradition. In other words, contemporary culture may have insights that challenge or revise long-standing established tradition that actually help the church. Does culture have a place in mediating truth, even at perhaps a secular level? I think it does. If you were to look and you want to, for example, do some work on movies in this whole Interpreting Contemporary Culture class, if you wanted your project, I would encourage a book by Johnston. And Johnston goes through and he begins to look at how God, even in the Bible, uses secular forces to bring about His will and His way to help people begin to sharpen their own religious practices. Do aspects of culture have something to teach us? The question is, that could sharpen and shine light on my beliefs and values about Jesus. Maybe we could. Maybe we could begin to look at even the most secular places of culture and say, I wonder if they can teach me something as well as me teaching them something. So we begin asking, what are the key implications of engaging and interpreting contemporary culture in this way? One of the last things that Lynch talks about is the praxis view. This is not a view that I overly encourage, but it is a view and I want to give it. One of the approaches that Lynch talks about is both theological and religious tradition and culture are evaluated on their ability to do something. Is there a greater sense of justice, liberty, and well-being among people because of either entity? The idea is that theological values on either side, any kind of great value or assumption, should just be laid aside so that something could be accomplished. Let's just forget about what it is that we differ about. Let's just go do something together. Well, that might be powerful in our current day. Let's just go out and do something. Let's just go out and build something together. I want to suggest that we don't just lay aside our Christian and religious traditions and convictions. No. But that we dialogue with one another. Let's not give it all up just to go do something. It seems that Christianity and culture is much more rich than that. So, do we promote the right action is the question. That seems to be the praxis view. The practical, let's just promote the right activity. So we have to ask with all of these approaches, well, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Is there any one perfect approach? What approach, as of right now, do you lean toward? I would encourage you again to mark yourself on this spectrum and ask yourself, well, where do I lean? Where do I belong on this scale? So I hope this helps you narrow your focus as you begin thinking about your paper. as you begin to think about, well, where do I belong? And what would be a key idea for me to think through? What approach am I going to take as I engage in a piece of contemporary culture in a paper? What approach am I going to take? Of course, Crouch's 5 interpretive questions. I want to begin to get into the questions that all of us need to be asking. Let's ask the right questions. I'm not going to read through every single one of these questions as I pull them up on the screen. But I do want to give you the list of questions in this session just so that you can begin to ask the questions. Oh, I'm sure there's all sorts of questions that I don't have up on the screen. What I want you to do is I want you to begin to challenge yourself to ask the questions that get underneath the surface, that get underneath the cultural good, that get to the portion of, I know I take this approach. I know that there's collisions of culture. Now I want to ask the questions that help me dig deeper into what are the assumptions, values, belief systems of those colliding cultures so that I can minister in those contexts way better. So here's 5 questions that Crouch asks. I absolutely love these questions. When I begin the process, these are questions that I begin with. Again, I'm not going to read all of these questions, but I am going to make them available on these slides so that you can read through them and you can begin to interpret culture. If you want to interpret culture, if you want to raise your CQ, then asking the right questions is bar none one of the most important things that you have to do. What I would encourage you to do as these questions are flashed up on the screen is this. I would encourage you to look intentionally at some cultural goods, any cultural goods, and just begin to walk through the questions that you have available to you. Take an outside water spigot, for example, or a bookshelf, or a cell phone, or Netflix, and begin to ask the questions that Crouch asks. What does this make possible? What does it make impossible? What does it say about the way the world is, or the way the world should be? What new forms of culture are created in response to it? And I think you'll begin to understand just the depth that you can begin to go when we look at the surface and want to go deeper, want to look at assumptions, beliefs, and values. Here are several questions by Lynch. Finally, I just want to give you several interpretive questions from a guy by the name of William Romanowski. He writes a book called Eyes Wide Open and asks in the back of his book just some very prodding questions in regards to culture. And finally, I would just ask of you that you consider driving yourself, being uncomfortable, by asking questions, cultural collision questions, in regards to Lady Gaga. Two songs that she sings, I think, probably ought to be evaluated. Again, I'll let you choose which approach you're going to take, but I think that maybe asking the right questions could prove very helpful in regards to sharpening ourselves and perhaps even offering something to the culture. Two songs by Lady Gaga, What I've Done and Numb. Go ahead, look up the lyrics to those songs, and then drive yourself deeper, asking key interpretive questions, recognizing the collision of bubbles that Lady Gaga brings to the table in these songs. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Next time we get together, one of my very favorite things, we're going to look at issues of pop culture and in particular movies. I will have several video clips for you to watch. And it will be very exciting. This is always one of the more eye-opening sessions of interpreting contemporary culture as we look at the makeup of movies and we look at the makeup of some of the things that perhaps culture borrows from the world around it and the things that we can communicate via movies and music and clothing, etc. So with all of that in mind, I hope you have a great week, and always remember that God loves you. Talk to you guys later. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.